which is again why I go back to the point that I foresee that the Democrats will lose the House in the midterm elections later this year.
What is the risk of a recession in the United States? Well, joining me to discuss is Chris Hattingh. He is a senior policy analyst here at the CRA, and he recently returned from the United States where he was attending a conference. So, Chris, what did you observe in your time there? What are some of the insights that you take away, particularly with regards to the economy?
Thanks very much, David. Good to be back. The first thing that hit me in DC was the heightened humidity. So quite a difference from being in winter in South Africa and then going to DC, and just the weather difference. But once I got used to that in conversations with people at the conference and just meeting at different organizations and talking to people in restaurants and that sort of thing over a beer and during some sport, it seems to be one thing that's uniting Americans across the political spectrum, regardless of their bipartisan issues, is frustration with the current Biden administration, with how the administration has handled moving out of COVID, how it has handled some economic policies, and how all of that has resulted in rising inflation and rising gas prices, or fuel prices, specifically gas prices. For them, Americans, I think, have been used to relatively easy ways of moving around, especially driving. Of course, car culture is still very big in the US, regardless of whether they're now moving to electric or for how long they'll stay with petrol cars. But regardless of the form that they use, all of the costs are high at the moment. And I think it's going to hit the Democrats especially hard in the upcoming midterm elections in November this year. They're seeing rhetoric from the Biden administration. We have tweets every now and then from various politicians, including President Biden. A few weeks ago, he admonished gas companies and petrol stations and petrol companies and told them to lower their prices. So maybe in his view, you can wave a wand as a government official and affect supply and demand in that way. But there's no serious attempt, I think, to address supply chain issues, which are the biggest driver of rising fuel and food prices, along with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But we're not seeing a serious move by the Biden administration to reform policies that artificially increase prices across the board for Americans.
Yeah, Chris, and as we pointed out in our risk alert on Monday this week, the US economy, I think there's a very interesting signifier there, which is that the 10-year Treasury note, the yield on that note has actually gone lower than the 2-year note. That's what's called an inverted yield curve, which is usually a signifier of an upcoming looming recession. What other signals are you picking up? I mean, what about the labor market, for example?
So on the one hand, you can look at labor market numbers, the latest of which were released last week, which indicate that the US economy is still quite resilient. The unemployment rate was unchanged at 3.6% in June, and the labor market added 375,000 jobs per month. However, this is leading to demand side pressures, especially in terms of rising labor costs. The demand for labor has pushed wage growth to 5.1% year on year. So just because jobs are being added doesn't mean that companies and warehouses and other businesses across supply and value chains can handle the increased costs of hiring more people. Maybe they're going to look at automation in coming months, which will lead to higher unemployment numbers. And just again, in terms of supply chains and those policies which affect the issues there, we're not seeing a serious move in terms of supply side constraints being moved to alleviate some of those inflationary pressures. I also think we should continue looking at the Federal Reserve and how they are likely to hike interest rates throughout the latter part of this year, which will downstream affect South Africa, especially negatively. I will also add that the US dollar remains quite strong, which is bad for the South African rand. So the US, some of the fundamentals are good in the economy, but we're not seeing reforms that are going to lead to more dynamism, I don't think. We'll probably see a relatively long period of midline growth, if you want to call it that. It's not going to be serious enough to see a turnaround in people's frustrations with the Biden administration, which is again, why I go back to the point that I foresee that the Democrats will lose the House in the midterm elections later this year.
All right. Yeah. Well, it certainly seems that there are some big political pressures building on the Democrats there. That's going to be interesting as a foreshadowing of what is to come in the 2024 presidential elections. So just back on the economics, Chris, you mentioned the Federal Reserve. They've hiked interest rates. I think the most recent hike was 75 basis points, which was the largest hike since 1994. That's going to put upward pressure on borrowing costs in terms of household financing and other purchases, and also investments into new business operations as well. But, our late colleague, Ian Cruikshanks, he used to say, what does it mean for us? So, this is all very good and well, but how is that going to impact on South Africa?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's well and good talking about these things in the abstract, but we're going to see the effects of higher interest rates in the US on South Africa and other emerging market economies. The South African Reserve Bank is likely to follow the trend of the US Federal Reserve and also increase its rates later this year, which means it's for example more difficult for people to buy a car, or it's more difficult to take out a loan on a home. If you're trying to start up a new business, it's more difficult for you to get a loan to hire capital or equipment, for example, if you're trying to do something focused on manufacturing or construction, which is of course very important in the South African context. Also, in terms of commodities, if we see the US hiking interest rates, that means lower economic activity across the board, which in turn means lower demand for commodities. Now, commodities are one of South Africa's strongest suits, strong points. And that means that if prices are higher for those, maybe we'll benefit from that, but unfortunately we can't get our commodities out. So those businesses and companies in the US and Europe may look elsewhere to satisfy those needs, which means there won't be as high demand for South African commodities, which negatively affects both exporters, but also the South African government's fiscus. So all in all, it means low economic growth for South Africa, high unemployment, and more frustration here with the economic situation. Of course, last year in July, we saw riots in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, and with rising commodity prices, lower demand for our commodities. That's another ingredient to add to the mix of possible frustration and mounting political and social strife coming to South Africa in coming months, as citizens in lower and middle classes are unemployed and they simply don't find the job opportunities because we're in a low growth environment in the country.
All right, Chris, well, just as we close off, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you think that the Democrats will lose the House in November's midterm elections?
Yes, I do think so. They have received some potential political talking point wins. For example, in terms of the Supreme Court's decision on abortion recently, that could give Republicans something to punt, and it could give Democrats in turn something to use to show, look what would happen. For example, in their rhetoric, they can say, look what would happen if the Republicans controlled everything. But I don't think that's going to be convincing enough for people on the ground who are struggling in a frustrated economic setting. So I think it's reasonable and correct to expect the Democrats to lose the House in November this year.
Chris Hattingh, thank you very much. Let's hand over to you, our audience. How do you think economic pressures are going to affect the Democrats in the midterm elections in November? Leave your thoughts down in the comments section below. Also, if you enjoyed this analysis, you might want to check out this video over here. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel as well if you haven't done so already. My name is David Ansara. This is the CRA. Until next time, take care.